Hi everyone, welcome back to the channel. I've got another brilliant guest lined up for today. He mixes politics with the personal. He's always passionate, he's always well informed. So much thought goes into everything that he says and does. But before we get going, here's an invitation. Come and join my patreon.com site and support the channel. As a member, you get access to an exclusive question and answer session every week. Plenty of introspection from me, also an opportunity for the family to talk amongst yourselves. There are no adverts, just lots of history, political comment, conversations, and the odd competition. Just go to patreon.com, find me by name, Neil Oliver, part with a little bit of cash. Simple as that. I'd love to see you there. It's also on my website, neiloliver.com. We get support too from our sponsors. Critical, important support. They are gold bullion partners. If you're thinking about investing in real metals, gold and silver, not paper contracts, actual physical metal, these are the guys to talk to. One thing they say is buying gold and silver is about wealth preservation, safety and control, and not speculation. If you want to find out if it's right for you, get in touch with them, Gold Bullion Partners, via the link below, and they'll talk you through it all. A real person on the end of the line, so to speak. Okay, now it's time to meet my guest, a very determined, thoughtful, passionate American citizen. My guest today is DerrickBroze, who's a friend of mine. We've done things in the past, we've chatted before, we've been party to the same conferences before. Derrick is a man of many parts, journalist, filmmaker, broadcaster, commentator, also very much an activist and advocate for change. The way we go about living our lives and interacting with everything that's going on. Thanks for joining me, Derrick.
Thanks for having me on, Neil. It's good to see you.
It's always good to see you. You're one of a kind for me. You're the person to whom I bring my kind of big picture considerations about, in amongst all the headline making stories. I know that you're out there contemplating alternative ways to be, and I find it very reassuring always when we get an opportunity to catch up. I've been watching what's coming out of Davos, that bonfire of the vanities in Switzerland, and it's jumping out at me this from Donald Trump, who at the time of our recording he hasn't actually spoken yet, but he has already said or alluded to or by his actions demonstrated that the rules-based order that most of us were raised thinking was out there somewhere, he's basically trashing it or just dropping the mask and revealing that it was never more than a fiction anyway, that it was always just about the exercise of power by the powerful, with a gloss of so-called democracy and so on over the top of it. Mark Carney, erstwhile Governor of the Bank of England, most recently so-called Prime Minister of Canada, is saying the same. We always knew that the rules-based order was really pretty much smoke and mirrors. With that in mind, I think the likes of you and I had drawn that conclusion anyway. But for those being taken by surprise by this kind of confession almost, or admission, surely people will have to adjust, to put it mildly, to the idea that the way the world, as they had been told, seemed to work, the rules of play, the boundaries, the borders, the etiquette, the accepted behaviours, is not there now if it was ever there.
Yeah, absolutely, Neil. I mean, I think it's a great time to be pointing at this with Davos going on. I was watching some of the videos yesterday, and as you said, Trump's about to speak today, and there's some other interesting characters who will be speaking throughout the week. On one hand, I do sort of see it, as you mentioned a moment ago, as the mask coming off, because I think that if we really look at, for me, being born in the U.S. and growing up in the U.S. in the last 40 years and watching everything post 9/11, and really, from my perspective, especially the last 15 years that I've been, so-called awake or questioning the world, it seemed clear to me that the United States already does whatever it wants and acts without impunity, even if in front of the television cameras and in front of the reporters or in their written words, they pay lip service to international rules and to democracy and different things. And I think they've been able to maintain that veneer, that facade of that. And in some ways, I guess we could say in some ways a positive thing, other ways not so positive. The mask has really come off with Trump, the first time, but especially I think the second time. And now it seems like other world leaders are following his lead on this. And what I mean by that is during, for example, the Obama administration, that was when I first started waking up. There was a lot of people against the drone bombings, things Obama was doing, the ways he was acting, very similar to Trump, honestly, but he was well-spoken. He was a constitutional attorney. He was the first African-American president. It was a completely different appearance and approach to the way the politics were being done, even if the end results ended up being the same, that there was still more war, more surveillance. They would at least pay lip service to the UN, to World Health Organization, and to that international rules-based order you mentioned there. And now Trump is just kind of making it clear the U.S. and I think their closest allies will act with impunity and do whatever they want, and not only do whatever they want, but sort of mock and make fun of the belief that they're supposed to care about international law. One quick example: there's one of Trump's aides, Stephen Miller, after the Venezuela situation, which happened recently. He told CNN, he said, "Nobody's going to stop the United States. Might is right, and we're going to do what we want." Just kind of putting it out there, like, who's going to stop us? And we're going to do whatever we want. And so we're not going to play your little game about, international rules or this and that. We're going to just act how we choose. And I really can't say that he's wrong, unfortunately, not that I agree with it, but it just seems like they're going to just put the U.S. empire in terms of the U.S. full out in the open and say, somebody try and stop us. And that obviously is causing all kinds of shockwaves in other places. And like you said, this is something that maybe people who have grown up believing that these things were more than just, just lip service might have to adjust to this new reality. And I also think that even when we talk about this old international rules-based order, which sometimes people would refer to the New World Order, I think that what we're really witnessing with Trump and his allies, not just in the US, but around the world, Israel, elsewhere, that they are establishing their own version of what some people would call a New World Order. Whatever you want to call that. Trump has even used that term more recently, but I do think it's something that people are going to have to adjust to if this is a new thing for you. And one last point, like I said, I always thought, well, if the mask would just come off and these people would be real, then maybe at least we could have an honest conversation. But it turns out when the mask comes off, it's even uglier and it doesn't feel any better.
Do you think very gradually, really, and then in that way that we talk about, very slowly, and then at the last minute, all at once and very quickly, I realised that other fictions were the idea that any of these figures were loyal to a concept like a sovereign nation state. I think the little people are invited to think that they're Americans, or they're French, or they're British, or they're Russian, whatever, or Chinese. But the people, and I think people like Donald Trump and Emmanuel Macron and Keir Starmer and the rest of them are just factotums. But the people making decisions have no allegiance to anything like that. They don't see themselves as being loyal to a nation. And I don't think either that they care whether they're dealing with, at their level, Christians or Muslims or Buddhists or Scientologists or atheists. I think they just have a higher level of control and power, and they deal with one another, and they allow us. They give us the illusion of allegiances like nations and things that people genuinely care about, but sure, those people making decisions don't care about. And I wonder that it seems to me that at the moment, America under Trump, and Russia under Putin, and China under Xi, they must all be cooperating. Those entities, there must be cooperation at that level. And the outsider, I feel, and I feel this myself, is Europe. I feel as if there's a way in which the countries of Europe, and Britain being one of those, we're being cut adrift. I wonder what you feel like when you look out at the whole world from your vantage point in the American continent.
Yeah, Neil, you make some really good points there that I completely and wholeheartedly agree with. The first being that these people have no allegiance to nation states, sovereign states. That's, there used to be this term, it's not so much around anymore. Now people say globalist, but if you go back to some of the older so-called conspiracy theorists who've been talking about this since the 60s and 70s and before, they would call them internationalists, that they were, their allegiances didn't lie with their home country. They could pledge to the flag and recite the anthems and do all the sort of patriotic things. But at the end of the day, when they met together at places like the World Economic Forum or the Bilderberg Group or Trilateral Commission, a lot of these different organizations that we know have been around for 50 plus years now, the Bilderberg Group almost 70, 80 years, that they come together and they set aside those allegiances of nation state, also, as you said, religions, and they get together and it's more like business. Like, for example, at Davos this week, sure, we're going to see the public talks that they give, but when the cameras turn off, you're going to have world leaders, business people, folks from BlackRock to Palantir, journalists, and all different industries hanging out, rubbing elbows, and making allegiances. And those don't necessarily align with their stated national allegiances or religious allegiances or any of that sort of thing. And I think that's definitely become more and more clear to people, is that these folks at the top definitely do not have true allegiance to their home countries. It's just something that they use as a ploy to kind of trick their home domestic population. And then also, I think, to the point of the religious side and these different divisions that they claim to be affiliated with, it's also a way for, as you said, just the sort of average regular person those people truly believe in their religions or their patriotism for their home country. But those things often seem like they're used as a way to divide us against each other as well, like to turn country against country, people within their home country turned against each other, while these folks behind the closed doors really have no allegiances to those things. And then to your other point about Russia and China and the U.S., as far as those leaders getting along and being a part of the same cabal, I tend to agree with that. I mean, it's of course we never really fully know what's going on behind scenes, and that's part of the problem. But when I'm, for example, seeing this, what they call saber rattling at home, and Trump talking a big game about Russia and China and the back and forth and them condemning each other, it feels like a soap opera drama to me. And it's really hard to believe that at the highest level. Doesn't mean, of course, there aren't Chinese people who hate America and Americans who hate Chinese and vice versa and all that sort of thing, because again, they get the domestic population to buy into the narrative. But at the highest levels, I do think these people are working together. And just as a couple of points on that, the Chinese state as it exists today would not exist without the help of Henry Kissinger and without the Americans and the Brits. And the same thing with Russia. There's many ways that once you start to actually study these things, that you can see that the U.S., despite, again, the saber rattling and the back and forth with words and condemnations, they have actually helped prop each other up and benefit each other in different ways. And so it seems like, besides what we're seeing on the TV screens and them going back and forth, I think ultimately when it comes to those higher levels of what I call the pyramid of power, that top level, if you will, or near that top level, they might not agree on everything 99 times out, 100% of the time, but 99 times out of 100, they're going to agree with each other if it means benefiting their causes, their goals, and even if that means to the detriment of their own people, that they will come together and say, okay, well, you can take this part of the world and I'll take this part of the world. I think we're kind of seeing some of that happen now under what Trump is doing in Venezuela, and with the talk in Greenland, and the talk in Mexico and other places, and almost sort of like, well, Russia will let you take Ukraine and what you want over there, but you stay out of our business here. And as far as the role that Europe plays, I think you're correct that there might be a little bit of being left out of the slicing up of this new world. I also do think, though, that, and you would have better insight than me, I do think that the royal houses of Europe, including the United Kingdom, despite the appearance of only being figureheads, I do think that they still exercise quite a bit of power behind the scenes. And there's this whole concept that I talk about in my documentary series, The Pyramid of Power. Some people call it the Black Nobility or the Venetian Black Nobility. And the short version of it is that it's just this idea that the royal houses going back to Venice and to Genoa and to Rome, and of course other royal houses of Europe, that they actually still do maintain quite a bit of power. They still own the majority of the land across Europe, but they have instead in the last 200 years chosen to sort of go behind the scenes and not make themselves the focus, and instead the politicians be the focus. So I'm not so sure that they're being cut out completely. Maybe we just don't see all the moves that are being made.
In a world of realpolitik and might is right, and it's just about who's got the most money or the biggest army or whatever other form of willy waving you want to put on it. What would enable, say, a House of Windsor or a Hohenstaufen or any other of the relic or ancient royal houses to retain clout, to retain gravitas? When you would think on the face of it, they would just be steamrolled out of the way by the modern powerful. When you were looking at the pyramids of power, I think really my question is, how sharp of a point do you think this pyramid of power comes to? Does it come to more of a sort of a flat plateau where there's a certain amount of manoeuvring and maybe differences of opinion and little balances of power shifting, or do you see it coming to a literal point where there's one set of decisions?
I think it's closer to what you were saying, that there's like more than, so just for those who are unaware of my documentary series, you can go to thepyramidofpower.net and watch the entire thing for free. We also just released the book version, and we are days away from releasing the final episode conclusion to answer that question of what you're asking, Neil. So I will answer it, but I don't want to give away the ending of how we conclude the documentary of the book. But I think that the short answer is that I don't think there's a single point where you have one person, one group, one family, et cetera, that is the top hierarchy of everything. I do think it's more of numerous different interests. So I absolutely see the role in my research of secret societies. I absolutely see the role that historically, royal houses have played and the aristocracy. I also see, of course, you've got the religious element. There's a lot of different elements here of people who have power over humanity. Obviously, just as one example, the Pope is an extremely influential person, right? He's not necessarily a political figure, but when he says certain things, it will sway the opinion of millions, if not billions of people. So you have these different arenas where you got the politics, you got the business class, you got the religious, and maybe some other elements. And I think that at the top, they all converge together, and they might recognize that, okay, you control a certain arena that I have no power over, but we can collaborate together. We can work together to try to achieve our goals and our aims. And to your point about, might is right, I definitely think that is what seems to be on display at the moment. Now, whether or not that is what the future holds, I guess we're all in for the ride. So we're going to find out. But I think that even without, say, strong military behind them, that the royal houses probably still could have some sway and influence behind the scenes. Because one of the things that I came across in researching the Pyramid of Power, and we won't go too deep into it, but I'll just share an overview of it, is the work of Cecil Rhodes and his wills, where he outlined essentially his goal to bring America and the British colonies back into the British Empire. And there are some people who still believe that that is part of the plan, even though by all appearances it's the American empire at this point. There are some who believe that the U.S. is still being influenced greatly by British and European influences, again, more under the table than out in the open. Because Cecil Rhodes, who of course people heard of Rhodes Scholars, well, that was established by his wills. He had 7 wills and testament, and in his wills, he specifically said that he wanted to form a secret society that would be based on the Jesuits, whereby he could use this Rhodes scholarships to influence young people all around the world and get them to promote his ideology and his belief that America should eventually be brought back into the empire. Maybe that idea has shifted over time since his death. Obviously, it's been generations now, but I do think that still is playing an important role. So I don't completely count out the role of the Brits and the royal houses. But I think what you also point to as well is what some people are calling the multipolar order now. You've got Russia, China, the U.S., and of course, Russia and China, they have their BRICS, similar to NATO. They've got their own sort of powerhouses they're trying to form, and a lot of nations are going under that. So some people have suspected what we're witnessing is a shift away from the Western world towards a new multipolar order led by Russia and China. And I think Trump, for whatever his actual power is trying to flex his muscle and say, hey, the Americans are still here. Maybe Russia and China are going to grow in influence, but we're still going to control the Western hemisphere. And unfortunately, people like us are kind of just caught in the middle.
It's so interesting when I'm listening to you talking about Rhodes, Alfred Milner, the Milner Group, the machinations to, perpetuate the British Empire, ad infinitum and so on and so on. And at the same time, most of us have grown up with the idea that of the relationship between the United States of America and Israel. The whole talk about whether it's that Israel runs America, or whether that the nature of that relationship is very much in the forefront of the minds of a lot of people. I think it's always worth in the context of what you're saying, remembering that in 1917 and the Balfour Declaration underlined the extent to which a Jewish homeland in Palestine was a project with British backing. Of course, Woodrow Wilson and Colonel Edward Mandell House and so on the other side of the Atlantic were bringing pressure to bear on their own account, but very much Britain. And then in 1948, with the creation of the State of Israel, it was Britain again. It was the British mandate and the replacement of the British mandate with the formation of the State of Israel. So it does, as you say. We always talk about the relationship between America and Israel, and people say, well, it's actually Israel making all the decisions, forgetting the extent to which Britain, that Zionist project was very much a British project.
That's a great point.
All the way through. Point. So who is actually, of those three, where does the balance of power sit?
You throw in the fact as well that those British mandate Palestine and that whole period from the Balfour Declaration, which the Balfour Declaration was definitely pushed forward with Rothschild support and Rothschild promotion. So you start to see some of those older names of wealthy families, Rothschild, and absolutely you're correct to make that point, Neil, that is something many people overlook, and maybe by design. Maybe there's people in power who don't want us, questioning folk to be looking in the direction of the UK and would rather, point the finger elsewhere. But at the very least, we can say for sure the creation, the beginning of Israel, it was definitely a British project with help from the Rothschilds. And now we're at a point where I'm sure it's similar in across the UK and England, that you're not allowed to criticize Israel to a certain point without being labeled anti-Semitic. I think you've dealt with some of that for some of your comments. And so that, of course, leads to many people, and this is something I do cover in the pyramid, like, okay, well, it's the Zionists or people who prefer the Jews that they say. I think that's a little oversimplistic for my taste. I don't think it's, again, one single group. Do powerful Jewish and Zionist influences play a role? Absolutely, 100%. They're up there. They're part of this puzzle. But I wouldn't point to one single group. And I know there's many people who disagree with that and will call me a shill for not blaming it all on one group of their favorite group. That's one thing I will say I've learned, Neil, in this research and this pursuit to try to answer these questions of who is at the top of this world order, is that there are very passionate groups of people who believe wholeheartedly it's the Jesuits. No, it's the Jews. No, it's the Freemasons. And if you don't ascribe to their favorite pet theory and group, then you automatically are a shill and must be, just trying to distract people from the ultimate truth. And I think it's less black and white than that.
Yeah, I mean, in terms of the history of the 20th century, so many overlook. I mean, you've never really talked about that. The Balfour Declaration was 1917, and at the same time, it was the Russian Revolution. It was Bolshevik communism. They happen at the same time. And likewise, the end of the Second World War, 1945, and then by 1948, you've got the State of Israel. But the way that the Second World War played out, the big victor really was communism. Soviet got half of Europe when when the Allies needn't have let that happen. America and Britain and the Allies allowed the Soviet to take half of Europe, causing terrible harm to tens of millions of people who didn't want anything to do with the communist project. So these things were happening at the same time, and I don't think people that get preoccupied with the one, Zionism and so on, they don't talk about communism at the same time. That was an equal beneficiary of those. The First World War produced the Balfour Declaration and the Bolshevik Revolution, and then the Second World War, in its aftermath, was the foundation of the State of Israel and communism taking half of Europe.
That's a great point. And to reiterate what we've been saying here is that there's some great works, one by Anthony Sutton, who wrote back in the 70s about Wall Street and the Russian Revolution. Another more recent look at it is by Professor Richard Spence. His book is similarly titled. I think it's called Wall Street and the Bolshevik Revolution. But they both point to similar sources and similar funding by Wall Street bankers. So if the Wall Street bankers, the capitalists, were so against the communists and so fearing of them, why would they be funneling money towards some of these revolutions and helping them gain power? And I think that goes to the kind of point I was making earlier, that there are people above and beyond governments who don't have loyalty to governments, whether you call them globalists, internationalists, what have you, that understand, okay, well, these communists or these socialists or these capitalists or whatever it may be, or this religious group, funding them, supporting them, and helping them overthrow a government or have a revolution, it could benefit us as long as we can make sure we can guide it or we can influence it. And I think that's been the history of at least the last 100 years, as we see these very powerful influences that are not beholden to government power, being able to use their money and their influence and their connections to guide revolutions, to guide civil wars, to guide the destiny of nations, really, and to make sure that no matter what happens, no matter who's in power, no matter what big game that they boast, and they can talk all they want about, we're going to go after the rich and the powerful, those folks make sure that they still kind of stay beyond the reach of those programs. And I think it's the same thing we've seen in Russia and China and elsewhere. And to that point, there's this, I don't know if you've come across this at all, Neil, but again, I mentioned the BRICS nations a couple moments ago. There's this certain segment of the independent alternative media, people asking questions like you and I, who, from my view, fall into this trap of, yes, the West has been this empire, the UK, the Americans, there's all this stuff to be critical of. And then they say, so the Russians and the Chinese are going to save us. They're going to be the new world order, but in a positive way. And of course, that involves having to ignore a lot of what the governments do of Russia and China, including digital ID programs and all the same technocratic stuff that many of us are concerned about. You can find those same things growing and existing in China, for one, but in Russia as well. But I do see that it's this sort of false narrative that, well, if we can't trust the Brits and the Americans, well, then this new multipolar order, the global South and these other countries, they're going to be the way to guide humanity to something better. And I just don't see how you take, these top 3 or 4 superpowers, throw them into a blender for one and create some new world government that's going to be good for us. And even if you say, well, okay, I don't trust the Brits and the Americans, well, I don't see how you can, put all your eggs in the basket of the Chinese and the Russians and think you're going to get to a place of individual liberty and prosperity.
No, I was watching, because of Davos, it tends to throw up things into your timeline that are in any way connected to this same topic. And I was, there's so much in the way of to be plainly seen. I mean, boasted about that Klaus Schwab, the architect of so-called stakeholder capitalism, worshipped the Chinese example. He had Xi as an absolute exemplar of the right way to go about running a society. That he was modeling the stakeholder capitalism he was saying was pretty much you've got it already there in China, and that was what he wanted to roll out. And so as you see, people that are violently opposed to the idea of Klaus Schwab, and like to mimic his sort of Bond villain accent, they're prepared to contemplate taking a good example from, or being rescued, as you say, and that's a savior complex, that messiah complex, being rescued by the Chinese model, which is what inspired Klaus Schwab in the first place.
Not only that, but Schwab loved to praise the Chinese model for how they dealt with COVID, which, as we know, is one of the most authoritarian in the world. Zero COVID for 2 or 3 years, people being welded into their homes. That is still, by many institutions, including I'm pretty sure American institutions, just sort of described as the ideal way to handle a pandemic. China did a great job. They went about it correctly. So yeah, you're correct to point that out. And there's other people out there who, again, I think fall for that false narrative. And it's just that sort of binary that us human beings tend to want to fall into, that, well, if it's not these guys, then it must be these guys here. It has to be that simple. I have to have choice A or choice B. And maybe neither choice is good for us, and maybe there's other paths. But I do think that we need to get past. I mean, we're talking in the beginning of 2026, right? So we've been talking for years. I know you have. I know I have been, about the Agenda 2030. And to me, it only makes sense that as we get closer to that date, not that there's just a magical, snap of the finger on January 1st, 2030, and the whole world's going to transform. It's that it is a process that is taking place right before our eyes. And so we shouldn't just think that on that date, everything's magically going to change. Instead, what we're seeing is this incremental changes moving us towards this world that they would like to see. And I don't think that, because we mentioned like Trump's going to speak today, and there's a lot of hype around that of like, is he going to go there and just tell off the Davos crowd, or is he going to, what is he going to say? And I guess we'll see. But I think ultimately what I see is that Trump is very much aligned with a lot of these people, even if on certain areas they disagree. Ultimately, again, their allegiances lie with each other more than the American people or the Brits or the Europeans, et cetera. And just I'll point to one talk that happened yesterday, Tuesday. It was between Alex Karp, the head of Palantir. Of course, Palantir has been getting lots of big contracts both in the UK and America, dealing with everything from facial recognition, tracking people for ICE, all kinds of stuff. And Alex Karp of Palantir was talking with Larry Fink, who's also, of course, the founder of BlackRock. A lot of people are really aware of BlackRock, but also Fink is currently the co-interim chair of the World Economic Forum. And so you have the head of BlackRock, co-chair of the World Economic Forum, talking to the head of Palantir, who also, by the way, Alex Karp is a steering committee member of the Bilderberg Group. So you had the two heads of the Bilderberg Group and the World Economic Forum sitting down to talk to each other. And Alex Karp's Palantir is getting numerous contracts under Donald Trump's administration. And Larry Fink has a 30-year relationship with Donald Trump going back to the New York financial scene. And in fact, last year it was reported whenever BlackRock said they were going to buy 2 ports in Panama, that Larry Fink consulted with Trump first and got permission to do it. So I just think that if you look at relationships like that and you really understand, regardless of whatever Donald Trump may say and pay lip service to, because it's not so much about what they say. Of course, we know it's about what they do, their actual actions. You can see that his web of relationships are deeply tied to these institutions that many people have been calling out and concerned about for years. So I just hope that people who have concerns about the Bilderberg Group, have concerns about the World Economic Forum, don't turn a blind eye to these things simply because Donald Trump's in power, because unfortunately that's some of what we're seeing in the United States.
Yeah, I mean, you raised the spectre of Larry Fink there, and also at Davos, he's been in terms of masks off. He has said, wind and solar, it's not going to cut it for the data centers, and we know that you mentioned Palantir, but to name but one. The American economy has been held up by 6 AI entities that just kind of, they're sharing the same money. They just keep moving it about like a blood transfusion. One of them just about turns white from lack of blood, so they get handed the money, and the whole thing's a fiction again about the seeming prosperity of the American economy at the moment, sitting on these 6 companies. So it's all about data. They're all dependent on the harvesting and more importantly, the perpetual storage of our data. And Larry Fink has come forward and said, well, you can't do it with intermittent sources of power like wind and solar. This after a decade and more of the deindustrialization of the West on the altar of net zero and the compulsory shift to renewables, which we were told by Larry Fink and the rest, was the only path into a sustainable future. That terrible buzzword, sustainable. So there again, the masks are coming off. They're basically saying, yeah, we've been lying to you all along. We deindustrialized Europe. We brought Europe to its knees. We've caused goodness knows what long-term mayhem in developing countries that because of the absence of oil and gas and the rest as opportunities for power. They're going to be held back yet again, kept down yet again. And Larry thinks as good as saying to the world, "Yeah, well, we're pretty much lying to you about that. The important stuff is going to be powered by the traditional methods, and the rest of you can make do with the nonsense that is, these, overhyped renewables."
We're seeing him sing a similar tune on. I was looking at the schedule, and they had a talk scheduled something about DEI and ESG are no longer relevant, and Larry Fink, he puts out this annual letter to all the investors, which really signals sort of what he's looking at. He just put it out for 2026, and he again kind of reiterated we're going to move further away from DEI, ESG, these kind of programs, like you were saying with the renewable energy and those topics have been the hot topic of the last decade. And I think that the way I read that is that it's just that they're able to read the writing on the wall, that the public has got sick of these kind of initiatives. And I don't necessarily think that that means that's, that the people have won. And so the globalists are admitting defeat. They're going to shift away. I think that they're seeing which way the wind's blowing, and they're going to make sure that they're, ahead of the game, and recognizing that the public's sick of it. Again, this year and last year, both their theme of the World Economic Forum and Bilderberg Group was about rebuilding trust. And so it seems like they're on one level at least acknowledging like, hey, we've upset the public doesn't trust us. I watched the opening speech of Borje Brinde, the replacement for Klaus Schwab, and he was kind of saying as much. He's like, if we're going to have a role in the future, if the World Economic Forum is going to continue to shape policy, if everybody here is going to play a big role in the coming years, we need to rebuild trust with the public. And so it seems like on a partial kind of, not a full-on admitting defeat, but admitting like, okay, we've maybe pushed things in a direction and the public is pushing back. So how are we going to continue to stay relevant and influential in the coming years?
Yeah, it's wonderful to watch. In some levels,
it is. It really is.
I'm always interested. Obviously, we've been talking in the first part about the macro, but I'm always at least as interested in the bringing it down to the micro and to the individual. And I know that you have a memoir that you've been working on, a biographical piece. I wonder what the recent macro events, how they've caused you to reflect, because I know that your memoir it deals with your own backstory of addiction and trouble of one sort or another. I just wonder how the macro makes you look again at your own individual micro story.
I appreciate that, Neil. Yeah, so the book is called A Man of My Word, How I Overcame Addiction, Depression, and Mental and Physical Prisons. People can learn more about it at amanofmyword.com and pick it up all the usual places. It's interesting that you asked that, because this book is basically a prequel to everything that I do today, everything that everybody knows me. It doesn't talk about my journalism. It doesn't talk about my activism. I mean, the last chapter sort of is the beginning of all that, because my dealing with addiction and everything, my mental health struggles and self-worth issues and all this stuff that eventually led me to get hooked on drugs and get arrested in 2005. That was like my first real awakening. So well before I ever kind of started questioning government and politics, which started in about 2009, I was kind of having this spiritual awakening after getting locked up. And so the 20th anniversary of my arrest was actually in November, just this past year, 2025, November 16th. So I'd kind of known for a few years that I wanted to tell this story, and I wanted to do it around the 20th anniversary. But it is interesting, just as the world is always shifting as it does, to sit back and reflect on how it is my desire, my curiosity about the world in general that first led me, in a big way, led me out of addiction, out of all the sort of troubled stuff I was doing in my teens and early 20s, and into the path that I'm on now, which is definitely a completely different path from what I was on. And so, yeah, it's interesting to sort of see that reflection. But the book mainly focuses on my experiences from 2003 till about 2012. So that's right when I was graduating high school, went right into college, got my own apartment, was doing all the things you're supposed to do, but very quickly got sucked into drinking too much. And then the drinking turned into popping pills and taking ecstasy, and one thing led to another. It was about a 2-year battle of, one substance after the other until January 2005. I tried crystal meth, and within 10 months I was locked up, and I ended up being homeless. I ended up living in a crack and meth house, and just I really had to go through it and hit my own rock bottom, and in order to start kind of turning my life around. And thankfully I was able to get myself sober before I did get arrested. But I learned later, of course, a lot of this comes with hindsight. I wasn't conscious of these things. I was doing them. I was sort of just in a emotional mess, and wouldn't you know it, you throw a bunch of drugs into the mix and it makes things even more confusing. I didn't quite get that at the time. I couldn't figure that out. Why is everything so hard? Why is everything so confusing? Well, maybe it's because of all the stuff you're sticking up your nose. But it took me a little while to get to that point of really reflecting and seeing, like, okay, my drinking and my drug use, and also, the book details my experiences, as I said, with self-worth. I started having experimentation with suicide at 7, 8 years old. I was a very depressed little kid. I started cutting myself and harming myself, and really was just dealing with a lot of trauma. And it's not to my mother or my stepfather's fault or anything like that. I don't know if they really had the tools to know how to navigate the situation. But with time and with reflection, when I got locked up, I was able to look back and I could see that I was just dealing with depression as a young kid, because my father had been in and out of prison for his own drug addiction my entire life. My earliest memories at 5 or 6 years old were visiting him in prison. And so I had all these kinds of questions of, like, why do we got to go see him behind this giant razor wall? Why can I only see him for 2 hours? Why does he have a black eye? Why, just all these different things. And he would write letters and make promises and say he would be there for birthdays and Christmas. And as you can imagine, after many broken promises, as a little kid, I started to kind of internalize a lot of that, started to question whether or not it was my fault, or maybe there's something wrong with me or my brothers and sisters. And then eventually that sadness, once I got to my teenage years, and he, broke one more promise of showing up, I kind of decided that sadness I'd been dealing with, I was going to cover it up with a lot of anger and what I thought was strength at the time. I just, I have a clear memory that I describe in the book of my father supposed to show up for Christmas after getting out of prison. He doesn't show up. I hear my grandmother telling my mom, yeah, he's already on the way back to prison. He had a real habit of getting out and getting caught very quickly. I think he'd become institutionalized. And I remember clearly going into the bathroom, crying my eyes out and just being like, screw this. I'm never going to let anybody hurt me again. And from that point of 14 till pretty much 21, when I got arrested, I was the, the wild kid at school. I was getting in fights. I was getting arrested. I was just doing I also was acting out. I think I was craving attention that I was seeking from my father. And so if it meant, oh, Derrick's the crazy kid, then I enjoyed that. I sort of thrived, like, okay, I'll be the crazy kid if that, gets me some sort of attention, or, I'd rather people be afraid of me. At least they know who I am. These sort of things that once I got locked up, and I realized I wasn't going anywhere, and I started journaling. I also had a very big grandmother, spiritual influence through my grandmother. She started sending me books on prayer and on meditation, specifically on Zen Buddhism and then Christian prayer. And I started to kind of open up spiritually for the first time while I was locked up behind bars, and started to journal and just really work through, like, how did I get from point A to point B, and what were the things I was hiding from. And so it was a journey, and I didn't get it right the first time. I got locked up for a year, got out for 5 months, went back, did that for a couple of years until by October 2008, I was released. And then I have a felony now, according to the state of Texas. And so I had to navigate that experience as a felon. And then it was shortly after that I started to question things like the drug war. I discovered the work of Ron Paul and Jim Mars and some different conspiracy researchers, and on and on and on to the point that I'm today. But the book mainly focuses on that crucial period of my youth and my struggles with mental health issues and drug addiction, and then ultimately trying to get to the bottom of that. And so, it's been a healing thing for me to write this, Neil, and to release it. We released it on December 22nd, and it's being well received by a lot of colleagues, and I appreciate everybody who's given me time to talk about it, because I know it's not the usual things we talk about. But one of the reasons I did write it is because over the years, even when we spoke, like, for example, at the Better Way conference, and then when we had you at the People's Reset in the UK, I'll kind of share a little just snippet. I'll just mention, yeah, I've dealt with addiction in the past, and I kind of allude to it. And every time I do, even in a small way, I swear without question, someone will come up to me afterwards and say, hey, my son's dealing with drug addiction. Thank you for talking about this. Or my daughter, or I dealt with drug addiction, or I've never touched drugs in my life, but this is the way that I'm struggling. And you sharing your story made it easier for me to, talk about it. And so I decided it was time for me to tell the full story, warts and all. I don't shy away from the parts of my life and actions I took that I definitely don't celebrate and don't, they're not who I am today, but they are part of my journey. And my hope and my prayer is that by sharing this story of my rock bottom and my turning my life around, that it can help anybody who's currently dealing with that, or anybody who has family and friends, or anybody who's been through that themselves. So, as I said, the book is out now. It's available at amanofmyword.com. And I look forward to, having those conversations, and anybody who's dealing with any of those issues can feel free to reach out to me, and I'm happy to chat about it.
There are many thoughts that what you've just said give me. But amongst them, I think about how important it is to be honest and to acknowledge that the path of your life, bumps and high ground and low ground, is absolutely what has brought you to where you are now. When I've been speaking out, a recurrent experience of saying the things that I've been saying have been people casting up at me examples from my own past where I didn't know this, didn't understand, you didn't realize the truth of what was going on, and that becomes a stick with which you can be beaten, because you weren't born. I wasn't born perfect. I'm a long way from perfect now, but because I wasn't always where I am now. But I'm absolutely frank about the fact that I spent the larger part of my life oblivious, trusting, believing in authority, all of these things. I make no bones about it. And I think in your story is so different and unique because we're all unique. But I think it's so important that people see each of us as an entire story. For a lot of people, you've come to the fore as DerrickBroze, journalist, broadcaster, activist, which you are, but you've become that as a consequence of your own story, and it's so important for people to hear the whole story and to know that in the past you got involved with drugs, you got involved with substances, you got involved in crime, you ended up in jail, and so on, because that makes you a more complete person to pay attention to. And not only that, what you make me think of is I've only learned in recent times the extent to which the flooding of drugs into America was one US administration after another was involved in that, was driving that.
Absolutely.
George Bush Sr., Poppy. And he wasn't called Poppy because he was a grandfather. He was Poppy because of his, enthusiastic, running of opiates, to raise money for the CIA, and then it was coming back into the US, and the extent to which, the same people that were driving, hip hop, were building private prisons, were pushing guns and drugs. And the whole thing became a vicious circle that was creating the populations of these private prisons from which these entities profited by having, incarcerated slave labor and all of the rest of it. When I say that the macro is important, but so is the micro, because you, in your own life, become an example of someone growing up in the last 30, 40 years in the US and being not victim to it, but experiencing all of the greater flows that were moving through your country at that time.
Exactly, Neil. If I just could add one thing to that really quick, it's that reality, that truth that you just mentioned, which ultimately led me to my activism in journalism. So as I mentioned, in October 2008, I got out for the final time. In the end, I'd done 19 months behind bars in Texas state institutions over a 3-year period. And I was now a felon. And, everybody refers to it other felons as you have a bullseye on your back. And I got to experience firsthand that, for one, I could no longer get it rented in certain neighborhoods. I couldn't get a job by certain places because in their eyes, being a felon automatically disqualifies you, even if it has nothing to do with violence, or, I didn't have a gun charge or violence against a family member or something. It was just possession of drugs. But just that label, felon alone, it stigmatizes people. And so I experienced firsthand the housing issue, the job issue, just the judgment of people assuming, oh, you must be a dangerous, violent person. And so in that period, in that space, I was spending a lot of time at the library applying for jobs, just trying to find, I just fresh out of prison. First thing they say you got to do, you need to find a job, you got to find stable income. And they sort of hang this over your head. Once you've been to prison, you get out and you're on parole, it's a little easier. But when you're on probation, they say, jump when we say jump. And if you don't, we're going to send you right back. We're going to add more time to your sentence. We're going to make you pay more money. Ultimately, it comes down to money. As long as you're paying them, they pretty much leave you alone. But in that space where I was at the library every day trying to apply for jobs, eventually, after I'd gotten sober and kind of rediscovered that I'm an intelligent person, that I love to think and question and learn, I decided to check out a library book. And there was this library book there, this book called Cannabis, A History, which was a really empowering book for me because it was about the cannabis plant itself, but it wasn't glorifying it. And it also wasn't demonizing it. It was more like, what is the legal history of the cannabis plant? What is the sociological impact, the cultural impact? And it was in that book where I first learned that the U.S. First drug laws, the 1914 Harrison Act, was largely based around trying to drive out the hemp industry. And then that some of the later drug laws were very much about racism, in terms of they were claiming, well, the Chinese and Mexican migrant workers are getting high on marijuana and they're going to come take the white women, or the black jazz musicians are smoking weed and they're going to come take the white women. Just these sort of narratives that were being fed. And then, of course, learning about the drug war and everything that you talked about, just the history of the intelligence agencies shipping in drugs. It opened up this whole door for me that was like, wow, this is not the version of events that I was taught in high school or college or anything. Maybe there's other things that I wasn't taught. And that was literally the beginning of me starting to ask questions. And eventually, as I said, reading certain people, watching certain documentaries in 2009, and that was it. It was off to the races. But it was really my own experience of getting locked up for drugs, which I don't think there's any redeeming value of crystal meth or cocaine, these kind of drugs. So I'm not saying that that I didn't have a problem. I clearly had a problem, but I don't think locking people away in prison institutions is necessarily the solution. I met plenty of great people in there, brilliant minds, who would be doing so much better for our world outside than inside those institutions. And the people there generally seem to hate their lives and their jobs, and they don't care about rehabilitating you. They just throw you away, and once your sentence is done, throw you back into the world and say, figure it out. So my own experience with the prison system, with the drug war, later was a big part of my own evolution and my waking up, starting to say, okay, well, that is something I went through. And in fact, I mean, to your point about the flooding in of drugs, when I got caught into crystal meth in 2004, 2005, there you can actually look up the research on this now. There was a huge flooding of crystal meth in parts of the states, particularly in Texas, where I was from, around that period of time. I don't have any evidence connecting it to, the other cases we know about, but I wouldn't be surprised to later find out that there was some other kind of surreptitious thing going on, because the city where I was at, which was, West Houston, living in the suburbs, meth was everywhere. It just popped up out of nowhere and flooded the streets. And I'm talking about high school kids, junior high kids, people of all ages. It was just out of nowhere everywhere. And of course, I take personal responsibility for my own choices, but that's just to say that definitely, as I looked at these things later on, and I questioned the drug war, and I questioned the history of the U.S. government and U.S. intelligence agencies bringing in drugs, that is what led me to start looking into other areas.
You're talking about drugs flooding into, or meth or whatever, popping up out of nowhere. Something very similar happened in Edinburgh, in Scotland, or on the east coast of Scotland in the late 1970s, getting into the 1980s. And it was heroin. It suddenly went from just not there to everywhere. And it became a scourge. Edinburgh, the whole Train Spotting Irvine Welsh novel, and then the Ewan McGregor, the hugely successful movie about the same story. That was that phenomenon of suddenly that coming in through Edinburgh and coming in through other coastal port cities. It went from zero to everywhere, and the devastation that it caused through society by the sudden ubiquity of heroin. And it was presented as just some kind of criminal fact of life at the time. But you look back on it now and you think, why? What turned that on? What opened the floodgates of that? We're supposed to believe it was just some sort of organic criminal enterprise. But based on what you're talking about at another time in history, but nonetheless, you just see the same things happen, and once again you look back and you just wonder. You think, how did that aspect, flooding Scotland, flooding Britain with drugs at that time in that way, that particular narcotic, why then, and who ultimately really was behind it? And I mean, I don't have answers to that question, but I just see analogy with what you're describing about Texas in the 2000s.
It's important to ask those questions. Yeah, absolutely. And I do find it just, I mean, for one, I'll just say this. I know that everything that happened to me happened for a reason. I tend to believe that, we're all exactly where we're supposed to be. And I don't know if the DerrickBroze you're talking to today ever happens without the DerrickBroze of 2003 going through that. So ultimately, I'm grateful for everything that happened. It taught me the things I needed to know to get to this point where I'm at, to try to be a voice to speak about this. And as I said earlier, my hope with sharing this story is that anybody who is struggling in this way, or has struggled, or has a family member, that this makes it, just a little bit easier to recognize that you're not alone and that there is hope on the other side of it, because I can count, unfortunately, on both hands the number of people that I know who have died of drug overdoses, and that includes people that I met during that time. As I said earlier, many of the people I met there are brilliant minds in prison. Some of them figured it out before me, and they did their time and they never went back. They figured it out before I did. Others are still cycling in and out of those institutions, and some of them are dead, including my own father. Unfortunately, my father died of a drug overdose in 2018. He was not able to overcome his own traumas and things that were at the root of his drug addiction. And I've lost since then several friends as well, even after I've moved on with my life. And so it's something that I take very seriously. And I do think even more specifically in our broader freedom, truth communities, international communities, online communities, I think that addiction, whether alcoholism or addictions of various kinds, are probably just as prevalent as they are in the mainstream world. It's just that we are the enlightened ones, we're the awake ones. So maybe there's a stigma and people don't want to admit that they are struggling in these different ways. And so I'm just trying to share my own story. It's been 20 years since then. I'm a completely different person, but this is who I am. This is what I went through. And if it helps anybody else in their journey, then then the goal's been achieved. So.
I just really to round it up really, and happily, hopefully, to come back to really where we started. When I suggested to you that the masks coming off, this revelation about how the world has really been run all along, and my own wondering about what impact that will have on individuals, what impact that realization will have on society. But your story is very much one of activism. Finding alternative ways to live a life. I've always been fascinated by by the idea that you function without a bank account, just as a single detail. But have you been watching where we are right now? The things we were talking about at the top of this conversation. Are you even more, I suppose, persuaded of the rightness of the endeavours that you're involved with and the community that I know you're a part of?
I am actually. This morning, as I was getting ready for this interview, I was just kind of reflecting on how, just as one example, how more and more of the world is currently questioning the rise of technocracy, and that as a sort of as a philosophy that seems to be guiding many governments, including the United States and Donald Trump at the moment, and like the people we mentioned, Larry Fink and Alex Karp. And I was reflecting on how when I first wrote my book, How to Opt Out of the Technocratic State, I was writing that in 2019, and I released it January 31st, 2020, right as COVID was beginning. And I was just sort of reflecting on it. It's been 6 years now, going on 6 years. And there's a lot more people, thankfully, asking these questions. And it was, I guess, kind of a personal patting myself on the back of like, hey, you were on the right track. But more to your point, I do feel like the path that I'm on, I don't want to say it's for everybody, of course, but for me, pursuing a path of building a community, I told you before, we've got land about an hour away from where I'm sitting right now. We were just there yesterday getting our roads paved. I've been harvesting avocados every week and bananas, and we're starting to build our homes this year. To me, whatever the world is going towards, I just know that I'm on the right path, because I don't think that the lives that many of us have built for ourselves, or that we believed or we would love and pray and hope that we can maintain and still stay free and keep our privacy and our sanity. I'm convinced that that is not going to be possible. And I think that the world is increasingly reflecting that. So I do think that, the path that I'm on, it's working for me. And I hope more people will find whatever works for them, because we all need to be thinking about, what is it going to take for us to maintain liberty, maintain privacy, not only for ourselves, but for our families, for our kids, our grandchildren, for the coming generations, those who are not even born yet? How does humanity continue to thrive in the face of what we're seeing? That's the question I've been asking now for 6 or 7 years, and I'm doing what feels right for me, and I just invite everybody else to do what feels right for them.
You're so right, Derrick. Those are the questions. That's the rightness of your approach is in the questions, with or without the answers. You're asking the right questions of yourself and of your circumstances and of the people around you. More than that, I don't think a person can do. That's been a good hour together, Derrick. I've very much benefited from it, as usual. Just let me thank you once again, and I'll look forward to a continuation of the conversation, and good luck with that memoir.
Thank you so much, Neil.